Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Captain Dan Pionk. I'm the Executive Director of the Navy Supply Corps Foundation, and want to thank you for joining us this evening. This is our third transition webinar, transition focus webinar, I should say, and we are planning hosting a few more the rest of the year and into next year. So really excited about tonight's panelists. The foundation is proud to serve all who've won the Oak Leaf. That includes prior service, retired, active, and reserve. And we need your support. So please take a moment now or throughout the webinar or after the webinar and click on those QR codes. We need your support. Make us a donation if you can. And also register. If you register, you receive our newsletters. We send a monthly e-newsletter out. Plus, you get our quarterly Oak Leaf newsletter, which we just published at the end of July. So again, thank you for joining us tonight. I think all of you are aware of the foundation and what we're about, so I'm not going to go through that detail and talk about mission. It's important to note that we are the only nonprofit organization that's dedicated to supporting the Navy Supply Corps community. And when we talk about community, it's just not the officers; it's everybody. It's the spouses, it's the enlisted, it's the grandparents, the whole community is at large, and we're really proud of that. And that's kind of what we bring to you. We connect you with the rest of with the Supply Corps community itself. So what can we do for you? Well, like I said, we are the connection. We are your connection to the rest of the Supply Corps community. And we also provide a lot of professional networking opportunities like tonight's webinar. You also can follow us on LinkedIn and other social media platforms. And like I said, a lot of our information we put out is through our e-blast or e-newsletter once a month, and as well as our quarterly Oak Leaf newsletter. And we get a lot of requests from active duty commands to send us hard copies because that's how they stay connected to the Supply Corps community. And again, we do need your support, so we appreciate that. Before we get started into tonight's panel discussion on career transition, I want to say a special thanks to our sponsor, CTG, which is a division of Blue Raven Solutions. And we're really happy to have Blue Raven sponsor our webinars. They provide supply chain solutions designed to keep fleets and systems operational, ready, and safe. CTG is a leading supplier of parts, material, and obsolescence management solutions to the Department of Defense and its contractors, as well as most of the world's largest airlines, MROs, and aircraft manufacturers. Again, special thanks to CTG, again, a division of Blue Raven Solutions, for sponsoring this webinar. Visit www.ctgnow.com to learn more. We're very excited tonight to speak to our panelists who engage you in a focused discussion on various career opportunities to consider when transitioning to the civilian sector. The panelists will spotlight careers on Wall Street, entrepreneurship, and the federal government. Now, it's my pleasure to turn the webinar over to tonight's moderator, Commander Retired Bob Dolan. Bob is a Foundation board member and is a Transition Committee chair. So, Bob, over to you for kickoff of tonight's panel discussion.
All right, thank you, Dan. As Dan said, my name is Bob Dolan. I am the Foundation Transition Committee head. This webinar, this is our third webinar, as Dan had mentioned, but this webinar will be a focused discussion on various career opportunities to consider when transitioning to the civilian sector. The webinar will spotlight careers on Wall Street, federal government, and entrepreneurship. This evening, we'll be hearing from several fellow supply officers in those career fields and what it takes to enter and succeed in those career paths. Our first panelist is Mr. Joe Purcell. Joe served 10 years as a supply officer in various assignments, including aboard a nuclear submarine, an aircraft carrier, as a major weapons system contracting officer in Washington, D.C., and as a special advisor for logistics to the Pakistani Navy in Karachi. Joe was a vice chairman, financial sponsors group at Morgan Stanley, and led a group of investment bankers focused on providing acquisition financing, mergers and acquisition advice, and equity markets execution to leading private equity firms. He also co-chaired Morgan Stanley's Veterans Network, which is one of our 7 sponsored diversity groups. So over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Bob. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you everybody for joining tonight. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and you don't have to worry about reading the screen here. I'm going to go through this. I graduated in 1980 and a supply officer for those 10 years, and I have very fond memories of Athens, Georgia. And it's pretty funny because I've actually seen 5 of my buddies who I was lieutenants with. We're all lieutenants together in Washington, D.C., doing weapon systems contract at Naval Air Systems Command many years ago. So it's funny, I'm seeing them like next week. I haven't seen most of them for 30 years, 30, 40 years. So I'm going to talk about Wall Street a little bit, and I'm going to try to stay on time here. I have 15 minutes or so. And I'm going to hit the top of the waves because it's a very, very big sector. I mean, Wall Street literally has $60 trillion of assets, okay, just to put it in context, which is about 3 times the size of the United States domestic product every year. So it's massive. And I'm going to talk about, in terms of a general overview, what are a couple of the different areas that we think of it at 100,000 feet macro level. And that's essentially the buy side and the sell side, if you're just trying to orient yourself. So the buy side is all the people that buy the assets that Wall Street puts out, if you will. So those are what we call institutional investors or hedge funds or foundations or endowments. So if we do IPOs and you have your retail account at Merrill Lynch or at Vanguard or someplace, they're going to buy the IPOs, the equity offerings that Wall Street is selling to them, okay? And they're going to invest them. So the buy side is for people who like to invest. If you have kind of an idea that that's something as a career field, depending upon how old you are, where you are in your career, and what you want to do, I would say it's very lucrative. It's very sticky. It's an area you can enjoy a really long career and enjoy. If you enjoy the markets, it's a fantastic place. That is not my particular expertise, but those were our clients, if you will. I was on the second part, which is the sell side, which is basically what we call the investment banks and in the mergers and acquisition advisors. The people that basically serve the buy side are called the sell side. And so think about the peoples, again, who issue the banks that issue the IPO. So I worked for JP Morgan for 15 years. I post my MBA after college or after the Navy, I got an MBA, and then I worked for JP Morgan for 15 years. So when we were doing our IPOs or bond deals, okay, whether they be investment grade or below investment grade, also known as junk bonds, I did that for 7 years. I was a high yield banker for 7 years. We were basically selling those issues to the buy side. It is a very high energy, kind of an intense world that is for a different type of animal than maybe the buy side guys. So the sell side guys, you're really thinking about your corporate clients, your private equity clients. I covered the private equity community for 30 years. So all my clients were private equity firms that buy and sell companies for a living. Think about people like Blackstone, if you've ever heard of them, or Carlyle or Apollo. Those were my clients. And they buy and sell companies. So I would provide, my colleagues and I would provide the acquisition financing for them to buy the companies. And then as they thought about building the companies, we'd give them advice on targets that they might want to merge with or divisions they might want to buy out of corporates to build those companies up. And then at some point after 3-5 years, they would sell them and we would provide the mergers and acquisition advice, or we would help them to prepare it to take public. Along the way, we would also do derivatives if they needed hedging for foreign exchange positions or interest rate positions. We would provide all of that. So my clients, as again, covering private equity, would be the senior partners of those private equity firms who owned all these various companies. There's about 300 to 400 private equity firms in the United States, from the Blackstones and the Carlyles of the world, all the way down to the middle market guys I covered were kind of like $1 to $2 billion of assets under management. I did want to touch on discussion of the kind of people that would want to go, and then what the military brings to the table. I've talked about personality a little bit, and it is kind of different kinds of personality. And then even within investment banking, or the sell side, as I call it, there's different kinds of people that occupy client coverage. We'll call that relationship managers, which I basically was, if you will. And then product people who are more experts at equity capital markets or mergers and acquisitions and this kind of thing. Those are kind of product experts, right? But it takes different kind of personalities and skill sets. You might want to think as a general matter, even though I didn't have a finance background in college, people who like numbers, and if you just have a natural affinity for that kind of thing, or you like which they're called on Wall Street, deals, like short-term projects, preparing a company for an IPO or an M&A assignment, that's usually 3 to 6 months. If that kind of thing appeals to you, then and all the excitement around that, working with a company, that would be the right thing. On the buy side, it's normally a longer term kind of relationship with a company over 5 or 10 years, or an industry that you're following, but you're not selling them products. You're helping to invest the money on behalf of the institutional investors, and you follow companies in a different way. So different kinds of personalities, different kind of skill sets. I would say what military people bring to the table, and this is really important, and as Bob was kind of mentioned, I was fortunate to co-chair the Veterans Network. I'll get into networking in a second. But, military people and supply officers bring a certain acumen, especially supply officers, to the table, because we're kind of the deal guys, if you will, for the Navy, right? That's the way I've always thought of it. We're the business end of the Navy, right? So, just serving the line officers, which is a freaking pain in the ass, as we all know. I hope that brings a smile to some of your face, but we've all had great skippers or commanding officers and line officer colleagues, and we've had ones pain in the butt. You learn to navigate that, just like in the corporate life. It's the same thing. So that DNA does transition well to the civilian world. But the military, we bring such an incredible focus and kind of mission orientation, but sometimes we're going to have to do is smooth our feathers a little bit. Is what I tell the juniors on this military veterans network we had of some 1,000 people at Morgan Stanley. You just have the civilians just talk funny. They talk different. They talk differently. They present themselves differently. Things are much more subtle. But if you can bring the fire and the energy and the get it done attitude that we did as supply officers and military officers to the table, and we learn how to kind of smooth our feathers or adjust our style a little bit, home run, absolute home run. You'll kill it. Okay, that's just something to talk about in terms of the military as opposed to people who come from a civilian lifestyle, at least at Wall Street. First step of entry into Wall Street would be along the lines of education, degrees and coursework. If you don't have a finance background, I would recommend coursework. There are tutorials that are available online. Then let's talk about connections. Okay, as you start to think about it, I've mentioned a couple of times we have 1,000 veterans. I literally just retired like 5 days ago. So as I was a co-chair, I have 2 co-chairs there now. Happy to introduce anybody to them. There are all of the major Wall Street firms have a veterans network and have veterans network heads. Okay, I know who they are. My colleagues that are there. If you want to talk to them, the best thing to do is to talk to both senior and junior people to learn what on the ground people do day to day. You can't read that. You can, but you can't get a real pulse on it unless you talk to people. So veterans networkers, there's networks, there's recruiters and HR people. Forming relationships early is important. The DoD has a program called Hiring Our Heroes, which Morgan Stanley would use. We used it kind of extensively. We ramped it up in the last few years. We have like 40 people in their cohorts. And what that is the DoD will provide, I think it's 3 months, fully paid while you're still on active duty to work for various companies. Okay. Morgan Stanley has a program. JP Morgan, all the Wall Street firms have a program, as do other corporate employers. So check that out if you have that time. You also have to be aware of summer internships. A lot of you guys are off cycle. So, recruiting cycles for Wall Street, they're really focused on at the undergraduate level, the summer internships, between junior and senior year in college. That's where they're going to get 95% of their full-time hires is for summer internships. Same kind of thing with MBAs. If you decide to go that track, that's a natural transition, which is what I did. After my 10 years, I applied, and I could talk for hours on this stuff, and I'm not going to because I got 15 minutes here, but I have started to apply to B school my 8th year or so. I got rejected first time around because I didn't know what I was doing. That's why you want to talk to people early who've done it. I got accepted on the 3rd time to Harvard Business School. That's where I went. But there's a lot of great business schools that you can use as a transition to Wall Street. Okay, so You don't have to go to one of the top 5 or 10 or whatever it is, but the brand name does help. Don't get me wrong. So applying early, if that's what you want to do, if you're young enough to do that, you should think about that. Barriers to watch out for. These jobs are competed for fiercely by many people. They just are. Don't think you got like magic fairy dust because you're military. It is helpful because these veterans networks did not exist 20, 30 years ago when I got into it. They just didn't. In fact, I was a little post-Vietnam. People didn't really like the military. That's a whole separate thing. Post 9/11, they really, really do, and they see the value. But they're highly competed for. Recognize your off cycle. So the people that are generally successful, unless you're going through an MBA program and you can apply for a summer internship, you have to figure out ways to get in otherwise. So be talking often and early. Again, people like the military, but you have to kind of make connections, figure out a good window in, and that's a follow-up. So year plus in advance, I'd recommend for any of you guys thinking about it. Don't wait a few months. You're way too late. Way too late. Year plus is fine. To do a nice balance between forming a good and regular rhythm of follow-up with the people you talk to. People want to know what's going on. They don't really want to. If you reach out to them and touch base and suck some of their knowledge, they won't mind because you're a fellow brother or sister in arms, right? They won't mind doing that. But if you're really following a trajectory, you want to kind of form a relationship with them, they're going to be much more helpful if you keep them posted. And it will really help your reputation and candidacy. Set up for success. Talk to a lot of people at multiple firms. Guys and gals, go broad and wide. Broad and wide. You can shoot for the top star, whatever firms you think are the top ones. We don't need to talk about brand names. We can talk about that. But go broad and wide because you can always move later if you're really interested in Wall Street. Be flexible, okay? And don't get yourself thinking that you heard at the water cooler that mergers and acquisitions is the thing to do, and you keep on saying the same thing. No, listen to what people are telling you who've been doing the business for a while, junior and senior, and you're gonna be much more well off. I noted a couple other things here. Get in the business. Don't worry about the brand. You can, if you don't land at your first choice, you bring a lot to the table, but stay humble. You guys are all great athletes. Okay, you're all great athletes, but the people that are competing with you these jobs are also great athletes from where they come. But you have the skill set to be successful. I put my email at the bottom. If anybody's interested, I can try to hook you up with the Morgan Stanley Veterans Network. And then one of my colleagues who's on this working team of about 20 of the 1,000 veterans, and they all love to talk to veterans all day long. He knows the veteran network heads at all the other firms, Barclays, BAML, Goldman Sachs, what have you. We know them as just a din of my personality. I was always a big organizer, so I hold a lot of events at Morgan Stanley. So I now know a lot of people, and I could help connect you personally or with the Morgan Stanley Veterans Network. There were some questions that came in that I want to touch on briefly that in the last 2 minutes or so I have here. Thoughts on ageism in the workplace. I would tell you that Wall Street, if you want to get into Wall Street, there's two ways. I've been talking about the deal environment. I will tell you, just for you that may not be interested in finance, that at a Morgan Stanley with 85,000 employees, or Wall Street in general, there are a lot of jobs that are like project management, operations, technology. I have found that the 40-some-year-olds that are coming in, like after a full career or near full career, we tend to hire in those kinds of jobs. And there's a lot of those kinds of jobs. So when I talk about investment banking, that's more for the guys. I was like 31, 33 when I transitioned, which is totally fine. At 35, I was a first-year associate, okay? So that's not too late. You get in your late 30s or early 40s, you're not going to want to be a first-year investment banker, if I'm talking straight up to you as a friend, okay? Asking for salary will kind of be given to you, so that's not something to talk about. These are questions that came in. I talked about adjustments need to be made. Joining Navy Reserves. I stayed in the Navy Reserves for 10 years, and I retired as an 05. That's why I'm a retired commander. You can do it on Wall Street. So if any of you want to do it, you can absolutely do it. And they will allow, there's a lot more encouragement than there was 20, 30 years ago for this kind of thing. And I did my 2 weeks active duty. I did my weekend thing and I loved it. So I just turned 65 and I'm going to try care for life now, right? I never used that before, but I'm going to do that in addition to Medicare. So that stuff is, and then you get paid, right? So, if you retire, so it's something to think about. We talked about leveraging your skill sets. How much weight to place on certification, somebody asked. I would say if you're thinking about a transition and you're young enough, absolutely think about getting an MBA, because you'll start as an associate as opposed to an analyst. You don't really want to start as an analyst after 4 or 5 years in the Navy or 10 years in the Navy, because that cohort is all 23-year-olds coming out of college. Okay. So think about an MBA, or think about coursework. Not sure the coursework alone will land you a job on Wall Street on the sell side anyway, but it might on the buy side. And there's a lot of jobs on Wall Street. It's massive. Biggest mistake I made in transitioning, last comment I'll make, I saw that as a question, is I wasn't aware enough. I wasn't situationally aware enough. I didn't talk to people on Wall Street. I didn't network. Please network. There's a lot of organizations. There's another organization called Veterans on Wall Street, or VOWS. There's all kinds of tutorials. There's all kinds of transition programs that didn't exist. They're all online. Check them out. And actually, I think Morgan Stanley has a veterans portal too on its website that has a lot of commonly asked questions. That's what I got. Bob, I think I'm at time. And if there's nothing else, I will turn the mic back to you, sir.
Okay, well, thank you. One thing I wanted to, you did talk about the resources available for getting into Wall Street, but one of our listeners mentioned that he had done a internship with Dean Witter Reynolds between his first and second year of the MBA program. Is that something that all the Wall Street firms offer?
Yes, that's really common, Bob. That was that summer internships I was talking about. That is the right thing to do. And even if you don't land at your internship as the permanent job, by exhibiting what area you're interested in, or having a story to show to your full-time employer after you get done with your program, that builds your experience base, and it's very highly positively looked on.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next panelist, who is Mr. Francis Tisak. Francis served over 30 years as an active duty supply corps officer. His last duty was with the Defense Logistics Agency, where he was Chief of Staff for Acquisition. Upon leaving active duty, Mr. Tisak has been serving in the office of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy Research, Development, and Acquisition since September of 2014. In his current assignment, he supports a Department of Navy Services acquisition portfolio valued in excess of $50 billion. Francis also leads a task team that conducts contractual services assessment and reviews across the Department of the Navy. And I know that I have gotten a lot of questions from people who wanted to enter the government service. So I think a lot of people will be listening to this quite a bit. So over to you, Francis.
Hey, thanks much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, it's always good to test out these the audio and visual functions. IT is great when it works, but hey, I'm happy to be with you all tonight, and I really got to commend all the attendees. We got 100 plus, and when I was in 06, I used to go to the sessions where we would meet with 03s and 04s and talk about we provide some career mentoring, if you will, in a large group session. And one of the comments I used to make to those folks is that you're already in your top half, that by virtue of the fact that you're here and in the room. And just think about those that didn't bother to show up, and they're really at a disadvantage. And so one of the takes that I want to pass on to you is that take advantage of all these transition training opportunities, whether it be the Rulin clinic or whether it be your TAP classes, ETAP class. Do all of the above, because you pick up a little bit from every different event and every different session that you find yourself in. So this should not be your last session, and hopefully this isn't your first, but again, this remains a continuing learning event. I also want to put in a plug for the Supply Corps Association, Supply Corps Foundation. The Supply Corps Mafia is alive and well. especially both in the private sector and in the government service sector. As mentioned by Joe, great opportunities for networking, which I'll talk about in my presentation as well. But really, stay engaged through with the community. Ensure that you're starting now with your local Supply Corps Association, and keep that relationship going for the rest of your life, at least for the rest of your working life. So with that, let me turn to the next slide, please. And I want to jump right in. I won't read each and every bullet because these are pretty self-explanatory, but I do want to highlight the fact that the U.S. civil service system is a huge employer. Over 2.75 million across the country. And if you happen to end your career within the DC area, you could see a rather significant footprint that we have, and not just that, but because of the locality pay, it's generally pretty well paying jobs here within the DC area as well. So, and again, if you want to stick close to home, i.e. within DoD, you could see that again, a rather significant footprint, 60,000 opportunities just within the Beltway alone for DoD. You look at the list of numerous career fields, those are all areas of expertise that transitioning Supply Corps officers have, and so you could very easily apply for positions in any of those career fields. The requirements are pretty straightforward. Citizenship, of course. I think you all are above. Certainly have no issue with the age requirement, but that does make you. I do want to make a comment because it was one of the questions that was provided in advance. Age is less of a factor in civil service. I would dare say it's hardly a factor at all, I would think. Again, I served the full 30 years. So if you do the math, I left at age 52, and no issues at all with regards to coming into civil service at that age. It might make a difference in certain career fields in the private sector, but when it comes to government service, not really, not really the case there. Next slide, please. Some of the pro and cons. One thing I really want to point out, and again, why people want to do what they want to do post-military career. It is personal, and it's what you like to do. I used to tell again junior officers that I would mentor is even like as you take your various career steps, your personal preferences has to play into it, and you have to engage your family as well. Where do they want to live? Where do you want your kids to go to school? Do you want to stay in one spot? And so those same types of questions you ask throughout your career, they apply whether you're public service or or within the private sector. I personally, I took the path of comfort zone. Okay, I enjoyed what I did in uniform, and so in my view, by continuing as a civil servant, I could do this very similar type of work I did while on active duty. And so when you do that, obviously the learning curve is not nearly as steep as it might be if you're going off into a whole different area. And you could even take different, you could take that down different paths, whereas you could still have the quasi comfort zone of being a civil servant. And yet, if you want to do something a little different, you're not necessarily constrained to DoD. Homeland Security is pretty close to what we do in some respect, but you could really go out in different areas, go work for Department of Labor or Health and Human Services, because they require the same type of skills that I had listed on the previous slide. So you see the pros listed there above. It's a pretty decent income. I can't complain about it, particularly with the retirement income from being a retired 06. Compared to the private sector, I feel that we've got a significant more level of job security. I have many friends in the private sector who were defense contractors, and they relate to me that they're as good as their current contract. And so they have to stay on top of that. If they can't keep the contract coming, they got to look for something else. You've got a little less pressure in that regard when you work as a civil servant. Could there be a RIF or a reduction force? Yeah, it's always possible, but they look for ways to minimize the impact and to place you and things of that nature. So bottom line, I think as far as pay and benefits, it's a pretty decent career. On the cons, salary is whereas it is a pro because it's pretty respectable. One could argue that there are limitations, and you could work pretty hard, and the level of bonuses is not what it is within the private sector. And perhaps if you're a real go-getter, hard charger, a really smart guy like some of our other panelists, you could do better than what you might be able to do in civil service. And it is a rather bureaucratic organization. You all know that from being in uniform, and that piece doesn't change. And you know too, it's like trying to turn an aircraft carrier around on a dime. It's just extremely hard to do when it comes to changing. There's a pretty fierce resistance to change there. And the one thing which again I'll talk about further on in the presentation, the civil service recruitment and hiring process, it is just archaic. And it's the timeline is just painfully long. And so you just have to prepare for that. And you also almost have to have the shotgun approach. You have to shoot at multiple targets at the same time, and hopefully one of them is going to stick. Next slide, please. So this lists out some of the steps for getting into civil service, and really the very first one, if you haven't already done so, please do this. Please do this weekend, and that is to create a profile in USA Jobs. There's the website. As you get into it, you're going to see some very useful tools, and one of them is the tool that enables you to build your federal resume. And when you go to the ruling class, if you go to the TAP class, the ETAP class, they're going to talk to you about writing the resume, and with the realization that the hiring manager in the private sector is going to look at your resume for about 30 seconds and then make a decision that they want to continue on with that or not. It's a lot different in the public sector, whereas the resume is significantly longer. We're talking pages long. A dozen pages is not uncommon for a federal resume. The other point that I want to make, and this is probably not too much different from the private sector back to your resume, is that you have to you're going to need to have multiple resumes depending on the position, the career field that you are applying into. If you're looking, again, if you're a supply officer, you've got a logistics background, you've got an administration background, you've got a contracting background. You've got to come up with multiple resumes that cover each of the different areas in which you're interested in applying for. Once you have that profile, and you got to get into USA Jobs on a regular basis, and just hit that search function, and you could tailor that search to geographical area, to grade level, to different career fields, and you could see what's out there. You'll see the different jobs are available. Read that, review the job announcement carefully to ensure that you meet all the requirements, and then you prepare your application as requested. Again, not all announcements are the same. Some may require additional details that others don't. And again, I'll reemphasize that foot stomp about tailoring your resume. And one of the helpful hints there is that when you see the job announcement, you got to pepper your resume with as many buzzwords from the announcement as possible, because the first search is done by the computer where they match up your resume against the job announcement. And if you check enough blocks, then it leads to a person actually reviewing it. And then obviously submit the application to the agency that you're applying for. Next slide, please. So here are some of my lessons learned. And again, this touches back to the fact that it is a very archaic process as far as getting into the system, and quite painful at that. Yeah, it could be painful. Okay, one of the notes is that not all federal jobs are open to the public, and in other cases the area of recruitment might be limited. For example, let's say here I am working in the Pentagon, and we don't want to pay relocation, for example. So we're going to limit our area scope to just the DC area. We may limit the scope to only people that are currently in the Department of the Navy position. We could refine it even further. So I work in the Secretariat, and that would be, hey, we're only going to consider people within the Secretariat. So anyhow, you have to be aware of that. When I back to the USA Jobs website, there is a feature that allows you to sign up for. I have listed daily, but it could actually be whatever period of time you'd like it to be. Whereas it'll do a search based on your preferences, and you'll get a canned email that says the following jobs are now available based on your preferences. And so you could, when that pops in your email, you could go ahead and take a look at that and see if it's something you might be interested in applying for. If you see something that you're interested in, be aware of the length of how long the position announcement is open for, because there are some cases where there is an urgency to hire. And so that announcement might only be open for a couple of days, maybe just even over the weekend. So you got to be very sensitive to that and look at that date and get your resume in there, get your application in before it closes. Look for factors that set you apart. If you're a veteran, you've got status, of course, that's going to help move you toward the top of the list. If you have disability, that's going to push you up a little bit even higher. And within your resume, ensure that you highlight all the good work you did on active duty that ties into some of the specific elements within the job announcement. One lesson learned that I realized, and was to my benefit, I should say, is that your base pay and leave may be negotiable, and it's particularly helpful if you're retiring at, let's say, a higher grade, let's say a senior commander or as a captain, because civil service, whereas they have the Mach 1, Mod 1 civil service pay chart, you could go in and say, hey, my last salary was X. And so based on that, I should be step 5 versus step 1. And that can make a significant difference, not just in what you're going to get your first year, but if you multiply that over every year that you've got remaining in civil service, it could be quite a tidy sum. So just bear in mind that that's now not every activity is going to negotiate, but it's something that you ought to look into. And your leave may be negotiable too. Your standard leave benefit is 4 hours of pay period, but there's a factor that goes into your deployment history and your duty assignment history that can get you to either 6 hours of pay period, or in my case, I came right in at the top with 8 hours of pay period. So again, that's something nice to know and to be aware of. So when you reach that step where they're going to make an offer to you, keep that in mind, and that there is some elements of your entitlement that you could negotiate. And networking is really something that's, regardless of what position you want to go to, private sector, public sector, as we're all going to repeat, all the panelists are going to repeat this, is talk to your friends, talk to your associates, talk to friends that are already in civil service. They're the ones that are going to be aware of the leads. They'll have leads. They'll be the first ones to know of potential openings within the organization. So again, that reinforces my earlier plug about being engage with your Supply Corps Association and as well as the Supply Corps Foundation and venues such as this. And we've got some wonderful folks that in the retired community, like I think your retired Captain Laurel Heckelman down in Norfolk, who's got this fantastic job sharing type of website that if you get yourself onto his network, you'll get like a regular email push that says these are the opportunities within this geographical area. Retired Captain Pete Eltringham up in the DC area does the same. So, this is all that networking, and those opportunities include both civil service positions as well as positions within the private sector. And again, I really have to hit home the point about you got to be patient, and you gotta. It took me probably about a dozen to 15 applications before I landed where I landed at. And what was the determining factor in me getting this position was in a previous active duty assignment, I was within the Secretariat. So I knew people already there. And wouldn't you know it, one of the interviewers, as I had a panel interviewer, happened to be someone that I worked with rather closely in the past. And so I have no doubt in my mind that certainly helped. That certainly helped the case. So yeah, you gotta be very aggressive on looking for the opportunities. You gotta fire off a lot of resumes. You have to apply to things that you really might be interested in doing, and uh, then you stand by and see how see what's going to stick on the wall. Now, I don't really have any commentary within my presentation about the interview process, but I think I dare say, based on my experience on being on interview panels, both as a member and both as one who had to go through them, that in some regards they're not necessarily different from what you're going to experience when you practice this through your transition classes, and perhaps not necessarily different from what you're going to experience in the private sector. It's all about selling yourself. It's all about ensuring that the people that are interviewing you can see how good of a fit that you're going to be based on, just as I said, you're tailoring your resume to to satisfy the keywords, buzzwords, and announcements. Likewise, you want to repeat those words verbally whenever you are going through the interview process. And so it just helps to reinforce the good skills that you have and what you bring to the table. I guess my final takeaway as to why I personally also enjoy civil service. I mean, I wore the uniform for 30 years, and I simply see this as an opportunity for continuing that service to the nation. I can't think of a more noble career path than to support our Department of Defense.
Thank you. Thanks, Francis. Actually, I had one question that somebody brought up. I know I retired from working with the federal government for 25 some odd years, and I know that some jobs require a 180-day cool-off period. Do you know whether they've eliminated that waiting period? Uh,
Yes, they have. And not just that, but the other issue was, years ago, and again, this gets to the post-Vietnam War era, whereas when you came in the civil service, you had to sacrifice a portion of your retirement pay just for the benefit of being a civil servant. And that is no longer the case. So you're going to
okay.
get your retired pay and your civil service pay. Now, that said, what I'm just mentioning here is really coming out of the post 9/11 era. And so, I mean, theoretically, that could always change back to a cooling off period, but that's not the case. There are instances, I think we've all heard about this, whereas a person will be in the office on Friday in uniform and they'll be in the office on Monday wearing a coat and tie. So that does happen. Granted, though, they've got to be retired. But it does it does happen.
Yeah. One comment I'm going to make before we move on to Bruce. I know one of the things that I did when I got into the federal government service was I was able to buy into the federal retirement plan. I had 10 years of active duty, so I was able to pay 10 years into the federal service, so I didn't have to do the whole 30-year retirement bit in the federal government. It was a great investment. I think I may have paid $7,500, so it was the best investment of my life. So if people are going to go work for federal government, you need to talk to your agency about that. Because it is a great benefit that they allow you to do, but you need to do that upfront and early.
I would agree with that. I think a lot of it also depends on, like obviously, like if you do a full 20 or if you do a full 30, if you do the math, you're better off to keep the retirement
Yes.
plans separate. But if you're leaving active duty, 10 years or less, that's certainly definitely worth looking into, because as in your case, and it's true today, it's probably more financially beneficial to apply that toward your civil service retirement plan.
All right. Well, thank you, Francis. I know a lot of people are going to take away a lot of good information from your presentation. So our next and our last panelist is Mr. Bruce Geary. Bruce served over 20 years in the U.S. Navy both as a surface warfare officer and supply officer. After an initial sea tour on the DDG as a gunnery and officer, and then a damage control assistant, he was an instructor at the Surface Warfare Office School at Coronado. While at SWAS, he applied for it, was selected for a transfer to the Supply Corps. Bruce did sea tours on a DDG and LSD. After postgraduate school at Monterey, his short tours were at SBCC, a joint tour at UCOM, Stuttgart, Germany, and finally at Land Fleet. After the service, Bruce helped and started to work for a company called Government Liquidation and Liquidity Services, which did internet auctions. They started by winning a DLA contract to sell all DoD surplus, as DoD decided to outsource this function to the private sector. Bruce took the company public in 2006 and started doing similar investment and recovery services for Fortune 1,000 companies and other government entities. He and his wife currently own Patrick Henry Ventures Limited, where they own and manage commercial real estate in a franchise business and an event center. So a lot of different things. So over to you, Bruce.
Thanks, Bob. Certainly, it's an honor to be on this panel with my distinguished panelists, Joe and Francis. And I know we're getting to the top of the hour, so don't sign off, because there could be some good nuggets here for you. As Bob mentioned, I've kind of done a variety of things, and my focus will mainly be on entrepreneurship, starting a business, etc. But I'll go through a couple of quick slides on my transition and some basic transition advice. So the first thing is like when to go. And like a couple of attendees actually asked questions along those lines, should I go sooner or later? And folks, there's no real right answer to that question. It's very situational. The basic advice I always give is if you're enjoying your time in the Navy and the Supply Corps, you got a good path forward, by all means, continue that journey. If you're to the point, though, where you're staying because it's easier, comfortable, you want to get maybe a larger Navy retirement, and you don't have to figure out your wardrobe to go to work that day, then maybe those aren't the best reasons. And it's a tough decision. It was for me. I mean, I was C-slated. I certainly had a path to keep going in the Supply Corps. I had a couple kids in high school. My older kids were in high school at the time. And honestly, though, I really wanted to try out the private sector. So that was my decision. But my experience has been also that generally, if you're staying in just to increase the retirement or because it's comfortable, you're generally getting out sooner is better than later in the long run financially. That's not 100% true, but in general, sooner is better than later to get that private sector career started. And generally, most of us will end up better off financially in the end. Where to go, we'll talk about that. You've seen a couple options from Joe and Francis. Preparation, you're going to hear these 3 bullets many times: start early, transition seminars, which I think are very valuable, and networking, of course. Next slide. So I'll go through this pretty quickly, but I thought it would be good just to kind of tell you about my transition. Initially, I did the Ruling seminar, which is very valuable for resumes and networking, compensation, negotiation, dress for success, all those things. But my first job was with a company, kind of a Beltway bandit company called Mantech. Support to FIS Norfolk is what I did in that job. It was an easy transition. It was comfortable. And I worked with a lot of great folks, but I figured out pretty quickly that probably wasn't for me for the long term. And that's not a criticism anyway. Many of our Spy Corps brothers and sisters have been very successful in those kinds of jobs and have had great careers. So no criticism there. I guess I would just say, as a lesson learned, I probably got out and looked for something comfortable. I think we went forward one too many slides. There we go. So as I looked for a second job, latched on with a startup company called Liquidity Services. And basically what we did is we won a contract to do all sales of DoD surplus property. At the time, the government decided that was something, DoD decided that was something probably the private sector could do better. They were right, because we won that initial prototype contract. 2 years later, we won the remaining contract to include scrap sales, and they gave us about $2 billion a year of property to sell every year. So it was a great business. We had that contract for 16 years. And keep in mind, this was in 1998 when we started this, and sales on the internet were very infant at that time. And around 2000, we took it online and just took off from there and took the company public in 2006. And we knew, though, that the DoD business was probably, not long-term success for a public company. Even though we held the contract for 16 years, great contract, we knew we had to branch out. So we started doing similar services for Fortune 1000 type companies. We had clients like Bechtel, Merck, Pfizer, General Motors, General Electric. And anytime they had surplus property to sell or did mergers and acquisitions and we're closing plants, etc., we did those sales. So it was a great run. I really enjoyed it. But about 16 years in, I realized I was getting quality of life wasn't what I really wanted. I have a 16-year-old son now who's about 9 at the time, and I was traveling every week. I had 300 employees all over the country and world. So it was time to make the next transition. But I think the lesson learned in that second job versus my first job with Mantech was, don't limit yourself. We supply corps officers have a lot of talents, work discipline, and all the above to offer the private sector. So just don't limit yourself. I guess that would be my advice. So for my third transition, I decided I really didn't want to work for anyone else. So started investigating a number of things. So next slide. Thank you. So entrepreneurship, starting a business. Well, actually, I've done all these 3: franchise businesses, commercial real estate, and a conventional type business startup as well. And what I want to do is kind of talk about each of those. And it's hard to do that in the short time we have, but I'll just give you a taste for it. And certainly if Bob wants to provide my contact information, any of you that want some follow-up, I'd be happy to talk with you or exchange some emails. So next slide, please. So franchise businesses. America's got thousands of them. And there's lots of opportunities out there. And I would advise you, if you're going to go this route, to get what's called a franchise coach. And basically what they are is they're headhunters for franchises. Most of them represent, the one we had represented about 150 different franchises. And their job is to try to place you with one of their franchises. And that's how they get compensated, is they get compensated by the franchise. So you don't need to pay them anything. So it's a pretty good deal. And generally what that franchise coach will do is they will try to figure out what it is you want. In our case, we didn't really want to deal with food. We didn't want to deal with a lot of employees. And so what they'll do then is they'll present you with, a handful of franchises that they think might appeal to you. And then they'll put you in contact with those franchises so you can start discussions with them. In my case, we were presented 3 or 4 different options. There were a couple of self-storage companies. One was called My Salon Suite, which was private suites for beauty professionals. And one was called Hand and Stone, which is kind of a high-end version of Massage Envy. And we looked at all those, and we ended up choosing My Salon Suite, which I'll talk about more later. But the reality is I would recommend a franchise coach if you go down this route. Lots of variety in franchise business, from small to large capital investment. My experience has been generally the larger the investment, the greater your rate of return. But of course, that means you have to put more money up front. So some key variables with franchises are the franchise fees, which is what you're going to pay to join that franchise up front. That can be anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 to hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on what the franchise is and how many locations you're going to open. Again, it's a lot of variety. The other variable is royalties, and that's a percentage you pay the franchise on a monthly basis out of your gross. And that can vary widely too. For example, 7-Eleven takes 51%. Now they do more for you up front in terms of build out. In the case of this franchise we chose, it was 5.5%. But it varies widely. But to use 7-Eleven as an example, yeah, it's 51%, and they do a lot of the build out. But a typical 7-Eleven only makes about $90,000 a year. And that's a lot of work. It's retail, a lot of inventory management, a lot of labor, all those things. And then the 2 other variables are really rent, what it's going to take to lease out the space you're using, and then build out costs. What is it going to cost you to build out that franchise? The good news about franchises is the federal government many years ago mandated something called a franchise disclosure document. And what that does is they have to disclose all the things I just talked about. What is the franchise fee, the royalties, the rent, the build out costs? What can you expect to make every year? What is your net profit going to be? And they have to produce that on an annual basis. So once you get in touch with the franchise, in our case, that our franchise coach hooked us up with, they will give you that franchise disclosure document. You'll have discussions with them, and then go from there. Need thorough due diligence. Make sure if you go this route, to talk to current franchisees to see how they like it, how it's going for them. And if the franchise won't let you talk to their current franchisees, that would be a big red flag. So then one thing I was asked to discuss too was financing. So this is a little bit of a tough time to talk about financing because interest rates are so high, but hopefully maybe you have funds that you can use yourself, maybe some family and friends, but most of us probably are not that fortunate. So you're going to have to go to banks. Generally, your local or regional banks are going to be more amenable to providing loans. But what you have to start out with is a really thorough, good business plan of what you want to do, whether it's a franchise or a conventional business. There's lots of lending out there. If it's a franchise business, there's actually a company called Fran Fund. That's all they do is fund franchisees that are trying to open franchises. Next slide, please. I'll go through this quickly. We decided in our case, instead of leasing the commercial space to build out our My Salon Suite franchise, we decided to buy the commercial real estate instead. Again, there's lots of opportunities in commercial real estate. I would just caution you there's a steep learning curve with it. There's a lot of variables associated with commercial real estate. For example, You can't get a 30-year note if you buy commercial real estate. Mostly it's going to be 5 to 7 years. So you can imagine that monthly payment is going to be rather high. But you can really reap some financial rewards if you find the right deal. There's a movie called The Founder about Ray Kroc and McDonald's, and one of his who eventually became one of his chief executives, Harry Sonneborn, because McDonald's was struggling. I mean, they were only getting a 1.5% franchise fee. They didn't have the capital to expand. And Harry told Ray Kroc, he said, you know, Ray, you don't realize what business you're in. You're not in the fast food restaurant business. You need to be in the real estate business. So that's what they started doing. They started buying the land, leasing it back to the franchisee. And that's how they had the capital then to move forward. And you know the rest of the story. So anyway, now we're landlords. So we pay ourselves rent for our franchise business and our other business we opened. And in addition to our businesses, we collect rent from 2 other tenants. But again, approach this with caution because there is a steep learning curve. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the franchise business so you see how it worked out for us. Our franchise is called My Salon Suite. There's 250 of them nationwide. It's quite disruptive business model. Think of Uber and Lyft and what they did to the taxi industry, Dollar Shave Club, what they did to razor blades, Amazon to the retail space. And it's disruptive because what we do is we provide private suites for beauty professionals, fully equipped. They just need to show up with their tools and supplies. And we have 30 private suites for rent. The difference between us and your normal conventional salon, and this is what makes it disruptive, is generally most higher end salons are what's called basically they're commission salons, which means the owner provides the space, some supplies, a receptionist take appointments, and for that service they charge the individual stylist 50% of their gross. So a lot of these stylists make $100,000, some of them more, some of them less, but 50% to the owner, that's $50,000. So in our case, we charge them weekly rent. In our case, it's $245 to $350 a week. We have no employees, so it's called semi-absentee ownership. So it's a win-win. The stylists make more, we collect the rent, and it's a great business model. It's been a very high rate of return business for us, and it's been a good franchise. And next, our conventional business. Next slide, please. So we had some extra commercial space in our building. Actually, it's the same building where the salon is. And we decided, well, what are we going to do with that? And we had a lady approach us who wanted to open an event center. And so we did. We leased it to her. She built out the event center. We had to go through some things with the city to get some zoning changes, etc. It was a crash and burn. She wasn't following any of the rules the city prescribed, things like hours and days you could be open, only doing private events. And then we found out she was also doing some ABC violations with her alcohol use. So we evicted her. And so this was kind of an accidental business for us. We decided, well, it's already an event center. We can probably run this on our own. So we decided to invest some money for a new look. My wife came up with the tagline, rustic but elegant. I'm about as elegant as an anchor, so thank God for her. And we researched the competition. What can we do different? What can we do better? So we started looking at what the hotels do, what other private event center venues do, and we came up with what we called a value proposition, where most of the other event centers and hotels didn't provide much. So we provide a lot more in terms of tables, chairs, centerpieces, tablecloths, and a lot of other things. We have a small kitchen that the caterer can use, so they can use their own food, which is where the hotels get you. They'll give you the venue fairly cheaply, but then charge you 50, 60, 70 bucks a head for the food and beverage. So we've developed this value proposition. It worked, and we've been open about a year and a half, and for 2023, we're on a run rate of about $250,000 in revenue. So it worked and seems to be filling a niche. So again, that's another way you can go with coming up with an idea. And my wife and I actually think we could probably franchise this if we have the energy to move forward and do it, which we don't. But this could be a franchise opportunity, we think. Next slide, final slide. So one of the questions that I'll address a little bit was, what were your fears and concerns with starting a company, starting a business? Of course, it's an anxious time. You're always going to have fears. Are you going to succeed? In the case of our first business was the salon. Can we fill it? Are we going to be able to generate the cash flow enough to pay the note we have on our commercial real estate and pay the bills? So there's always fear, no doubt about it. But there is a really great John Paul Jones quote that I love. And he said, "He who will not risk cannot win." So if you want to work for yourself and you're willing to put in the time and the energy, it can be very rewarding. And we knew we wanted to work for ourselves. It worked out. So no regrets there. And my final comment would be this, in terms of advice, lessons learned. When you're making that transition, open up the playing field. The possibilities are endless. Open things up to more than just something that looks comfortable, because you guys have a lot of skills to offer the private sector. It's a process that's filled with anxiety, a little bit of fear, but it's also a time that's filled with a wonderful opportunity to change your work life and get some great financial rewards. And with that, I will close.
All right. Thank you very much, Bruce. I think you've hit the nail on the head with for people wanting to go out and start their own business, which is which, as you said, can be very nerve-wracking, but also very fulfilling. I just wanted to thank all the panelists for participating this evening. You've all provided some valuable insight into a number of different potential career paths that hopefully people will consider and look into a little more deeply. I hope that everybody enjoyed this transition webinar, and if you have any other suggestions for topics that you'd like to see us pursue, please send me your ideas to transition@usnscf.com. I would also encourage you to take a look at the Foundation's webpage, and in particular, the transition webpage. I'm always putting new and invaluable information and resources for people that can use when they're transitioning out. The other plug I'll put into is the Foundation also has a LinkedIn and Facebook page that I encourage you to go in there and like. It's a great opportunity for potential networking, not only from among your fellow supply officers, but also for potential career opportunities. Ben, do you have any last words?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. And again, this concludes our webinar. I want to say special thanks to CTG, a division of Blue Raven Solutions, for sponsoring tonight's webinar. And also just thank you to our panelists, Joe Purcell, Francis Tissack, and Bruce Gertie, for just a wonderful presentation, 3 diverse, different career fields. We'll be sending out the recording of this and the slides in the next couple of days, so you get an email on that. And again, if you haven't done so, please support us. We do need your support and donations. And again, thank you for attending. We're looking for a great webinar in probably early October with the chief of the Spy Corps, and then one of our DAs, distinguished alumni, later in October. But this concludes our transition roundtable. Thank you again for our panelists, and thank you all for attending. Have a great evening, and thanks for your support.
Go Navy.